what is communism?
What is communism? Okay. It's a great question because that is like very often misunderstood, and everybody seems to have their own definition of communism. But how Marx described it um, is that it's the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. So, if you Google it, right, it comes up with this sort of technical definition of like stateless, classless, moneyless society and this kind of thing. That's actually not, how Marxists typically would describe it. We don't really want to be in the business of like world building and like looking into the future and kind of trying to construct a world based on ideology. So what we say is really what communism is that it's the real movement that abolishes the present state of things. You could ostensibly say that there is a desire to abolish class society. We want to sort of negate the classes, but beyond that, there's really a lot of freedom. And I think that kind of speaks to like the creativity of us. We get to kind of construct that in the conditions that it arises in. So yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so has a communist country ever existed?
I think a communist country has existed, and by that I mean that a communist country that is sort of guided by the real movement that has the desire to abolish the present state of things. I think that, with that definition in mind, a communist country has existed. I would say even a communist country does exist now, because it's not a mode of production. It is a movement, right? It's the movement of the proletariat. So yeah, I think it does. It has existed and it does today.
Yeah, by the way, just real quick, Trace, yeah, this isn't a, I rejected your invite because this is we're doing just a one-on-one conversation, so that's why. Sorry for that, but that's what we're doing. All right, so, okay, so that's your answer on that, so sort of.
Mhm.
So what would you say is the key distinction between communism and socialism?
Yeah. So socialism is a mode of production. And usually what we mean by that is going to be like the social ownership or the common ownership of the means of production. So that's going to be, it's going to differentiate from other modes of production, predominantly capitalism, because there's not going to be private ownership of capital, private ownership of the means of production. Communism, socialism is the mode of production that the communist movement has historically used. Some would say that it's like a transition period, maybe between socialism and the realization of the communist movement, like the end stage of the communist movement. But communism is not a mode of production, while socialism is. So that's kind of how they're different.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so this is where we start to get a little pithy here, okay? So can you
Yeah,
explain in the best way you can historical and dialectical materialism?
yeah, sure. So historical materialism really is it's Marx's way of looking at each period in society, and he's kind of trying to do he's trying to do a periodization of class society, how it's moved from one social epoch to another. So he kind of breaks out history in a couple different periods. We've got ancient slave society, which is going to be like your Greece, your all sort of ancient society, right? Then he's going to move on to feudalism. Feudalism is going to be sort of the monarchy, the aristocracy, sort of landlords ruling over serfs and this kind of thing. We kind of moved into capitalism from there. There's a little bit of a pit stop in mercantilism, but really we move from feudalism to capitalism. And what he says is we move from one social epoch to another through class antagonism. So, if you look at each period, you see like a social revolution that brings us from one to another, and that the internal antagonisms between these classes, the ruling class and the non-ruling class, really is what drives history and what drives us from one mode of production to another. And then sort of dialectical materialism is sort of like the Soviet Union's application this um, of this theory into like the natural world that you see natural internal contradictions and a lot of different things, and that kind of goes into Lenin's whole thing about imperial criticism, which is really that you can see internal contradictions as Hegelian dialectic in the natural world really everywhere. So yeah.
All right, so you did touch on both historic and dialectics there. So I got a
Yeah.
little distracted by the chat, but so if
No,
I
you're
luckily I have I'll have the video to watch it back, but I think I understand the concept sort of. So what does it mean to
cool.
be class conscious?
Class conscious. Yeah, that's a great question. So really what we mean by class conscious is where you fall in class society. If we're living in capitalism, are you aware that you're selling your labor power for a wage, that you work underneath the people that have authority over you in the workplace are going to be the people who have like a legal ownership of capital, and that your existence, your ability to maneuver through everyday life is kind of determined by your ability to sell your labor in the marketplace. So if you're aware of that, and ostensibly that would mean that you're aware of you're alienated from your own labor and the product of your labor, and that is exploitative. We would say you're class conscious. You're conscious of your place in class society. And the same by the way would apply to like a capitalist. If they're aware of the fact that their social ownership of capital allows them to have access to surplus value and the profits that are created from their workers, they would also be class conscious, and usually they are much more so than workers are. So that's kind of the unfortunate thing. But
I don't. I think there's. Well, I had a planned question, but someone in the chat claims that Marx stole his ideology from the French. What do you
I
say
don't
to that?
even know.
Yeah, that's what.
I don't even know what that's. I mean, who in France, what French? I mean, certainly he was influenced by some of the liberal revolutions that
You
France
were
was a
saying
part of.
Fourier?
Oh, I was no Fourier was a what we would call a ideological socialist, like a utopian socialist. These are people. In fact, he critiqued a lot of these people in his day. All the because Marx didn't invent socialism. There were a lot
So,
of different socialist schools
well,
in his day, but
you would
yeah,
say Marx is not a utopian socialist, correct?
no. In fact, Marx and Engels wrote a lot about how they differentiate themselves from the other socialist movements that they were in. A big goal of theirs was to say like these people are like idiots, and we want to make sure that we're actually different from them. We're not sort of grouped in. But the main thing was that, and I kind of touched on it a little bit earlier, that the socialists of their day that weren't Marxists were trying to build a socialist society like out of their mind. They were trying to sort of imagine what it should look like, how it should be run, and then like from their mind, from the abstract, that's how they want to build the world. Marx said we're materialists. We derive our analysis of socialism, of communism, of the communist movement from the material conditions that we're living in. So like the real world informs our analysis rather than the opposite way. He was like flipping Hegel on his head, as he said. So Fourier, he was certainly influenced by these other socialists, but really he was a big critique of them. So stealing influence, certainly he didn't just like hijack their ideas and call them
Right.
his own.
I mean, that was kind of a sidetrack, but I figured I'd address some of the chat. He disagrees with you, but that's fine. Let's move on. How would you describe like the sort of the or Marx's or the socialist understanding of like alienation?
Yeah, so I mean, to be alienated, really, it just means that you're not able to see yourself in the product of your own labor. And really, we can kind of like look at it, like a factory floor, right? So you're one cog in the machine of the factory. So you're on the assembly line, you're selling your labor power in the market, you're there, you're putting together the widget, you're passing on to the next person, this kind of thing. by the time, it gets to the end of the assembly line, it gets sold at the marketplace, you really have no relation to that commodity. You have, you're not really benefiting from the value that it's sold for. You don't really see yourself in the thing that your labor creates anymore under capitalism because of the introduction of exploitation and surplus value. So, really, and you kind of see this in like a lot of creative fields necessarily. People have that saying of like, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. But then you talk to these people who have made their passion into like a job, and then they're like, yeah, it doesn't even really feel the same anymore because of this introduction of alienation. So
We're tripping about the frog in your bio right now, but I don't want to. I've been telling them it's anti-Zionist occupied government. I don't know if they'll accept that. I probably won't go. Let's not get
forgetting about a
too
frog. I mean,
uncomfortable.
look, we'll get into. I mean, this is part and parcel of
Well, yeah,
like
we're
a
gonna
lot of
go
stuff I
over.
talk.
Yeah, we'll go
Like
over
a
that.
frog, it's kind of
Yeah.
it's a frog.
All right.
But yeah,
So I think since we have 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna ask you this question. You can answer it, and then I feel like we really didn't touch on everything, obviously, but like I'll give you like the floor to talk about something, and we'll figure it out. But the last question
thanks
that
for
I
making
have
this,
written
man.
down is what makes the dictatorship of the proletariat
Great
better or
question.
different than the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie?
Great question. Really happy you asked that. 'Cause a lot of people think I think a lot of people get tripped up in the like term, dictatorship, right? So when we're looking at the dictatorship of the proletariat, we're contrasting that to the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, of the capitalists. And what's really meant by that is like Engels' analysis of the state is that it's an organ one class uses to rule over another. So the state is subsumed to the class interest of the ruling class of that period or that country or that mode of production. So currently we have a dictatorship of the capitalists of the bourgeoisie, to use like the word. And so the state, acts and is guided by their interests. So you see the state utilize force to break up strikes or pass legislation that works against the interests of the workers themselves. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, what we would, hopefully, ostensibly, we would see that the state now is the expression of the interests of the working class. So, they're now using this organ to retain hegemonic power over the capitalists, and it's sort of used as an administrative tool to now subsume society to the interests and the best interests of the working class themselves.
I was gonna give you the floor, but I think actually, because I kind of want to use this as an educational experience. So let's do rapid fire. I'm just gonna ask you stuff and just answer it as quickly as possible. Um,
Okay.
in a communist country, there is no creativity.
There's no creativity. I mean, if you look at it, the Soviet Union, they had so many different art forms. They had Soviet realism, they had, abstract art, they had, playwrights, they had movies, they had TV shows. I mean, really, communism, I think, is actually the actualization, the expression of individuality because you're not just subsumed under the exploitation of wage labor. So I see, I
Okay,
think it's
how
the opposite,
about
really.
under communism, everybody would make exactly the same.
Yeah, this is like a very common misunderstanding. Under a socialist mode of production has nothing to do with, equality of outcome or like that Jordan Peterson phrase. Certainly, if someone's labor is more socially necessary and important than another person, we're not like anarchists. Like obviously this person could theoretically live with a little bit more luxury, have a couple more things than somebody else does. The janitor is not going to live the same way as maybe a heart surgeon or something like that. It has nothing to do with equality of outcome or something like that, or wages or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, just the people in the chat. I can do like a little after, maybe like a little Q&A if there's enough people here.
Hmm.
If not, if I have to leave, I'm willing. I'll probably be back on. I'll be back on tonight. I can do like a post mortem, and
Cool.
Emir, we can break it down even further in
Yeah, I mean
questions and other
we
topics.
can
But yeah,
we
but
could take Q&As, but yeah,
yeah,
I'm not gonna.
but I got like two more. So, socialism is inherently authoritarian.
I mean, authoritarian. I think every single state, every single,
Well, I guess I should say like
if
the question should be more uh, like the far left is the same as the far right. Is a
okay.
better question.
Well, I mean, that's just like silly because the
Well,
far
people
right,
say it,
you know,
so
yeah, 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 no, for sure, of course. The concerns of the far right are completely distinct from the conservatives of the far left. Sometimes there's crossover, maybe in like a tactic or some like short-term goal. You know what I mean? But really, the motivating factors of the far right and the far left are completely different. The far left is motivated and empowering and realizing the liberation of the working class in its totality. I don't. The far right is not concerned with that at all. So
All
yeah.
right. Well, you got a minute if you want to just like wrap it all up for us and like I don't know, just do something.
Yeah, sure. So, I would say really that, the important thing to look at when you're looking at authoritarian is every single society is authoritarian. Look at the Red Scare under a liberal country, a liberal democracy like the USA. That was authoritarian. They stripped away the rights of people who were communists. So I think the word authoritarian is kind of meaningless. Every single state is authoritarian under class society. That's like the operative existence of the state.
Right. All right. Well, I guess there's like 30 seconds on the clock, but I guess I'll wrap this up just real quick. If you're interested in this, I have a Discord, so uh, I'll put it back up later, and nobody's gonna. You don't have to scan it, but I'm just saying I got a Discord. Tap that screen, share the live out. If you can, hit that share button, hit the repost button. I didn't know you could do this, but hit that repost, put it on your story, tap the screen, gift Emir first as my guest. But so
Oh,
next,
thanks, guys.
speaking of Soviets, I know I don't mean. Oh, sorry, that was my time my
Oh, okay.
that
Well,
was
perfect
my like
timing then,
move
huh?
on, bro.
Yeah.
Hold on, let me fix this. All right. Okay, so I know like I'm not like an expert on the Soviet Union. I don't know much at all. So
Mhm.
uh, feel free to like kind of take the reins if the questions are kind of dumb, or just kind of that
Sure,
boring or
yeah.
not. Okay, so like how was the Soviet Union formed?
Yeah, so the Soviet Union, is essentially formed out of the Russian Civil War. Um, it was between the Bolshevik, the Bolshevik Party, the Bolshevik movement, really, I would say, against initially it was against the feudalist monarchy of the Tsar. A lot of the oppressive, really the agrarian laborers of Tsarist Russia were heavily repressed and exploited. And so throughout that exploitation, you had rise to the early Bolsheviks. You call them like the vanguard party. And so there's an uprising really of the Bolsheviks against the Tsarist state. They were able to overtake the state. Then there was a civil war against some of the reactionary elements of Russia. These were like some of the people that wanted to actually move to like a more liberal society, maybe some of the loyalists, and even some of like the left, but not, communist far left. And the Red Army was able to defeat those reactionary elements and gain power. It was a pretty brutal war, but so that is essentially that was like the wellspring of what the Soviet Union arose out of.
So I mean, like this might illustrate maybe a misunderstanding. Was the Soviet Union was that born out of the Bolshevik Revolution, or was that a separate like?
Yes,
Is
yeah,
okay.
it
So
was born.
why? So
Yeah.
like, why was the Bolshevik Revolution like so successful when like past ones were not historically?
Well, it was very highly organized. It was guided by really, I think the materials analysis that was utilized by the Bolsheviks was really important. They were able to look at the conditions that they were in and sort of formulate revolutionary tactics based on that, because they were using a Marxist analysis that was able to, take them to victory. One example that I can think of, something that I wish that Marxists thought of and considered today, was that they were actually able to radicalize the military. So they were able to convince members of the military to actually turn their weapons on their generals and, side with the Bolsheviks, really. And I think if they hadn't done that, they actually would have lost. So things like that, really just like progressive, acute, revolutionary tactics. That was, very not seen in that time. I think kind of brought them to victory in a lot of ways.
Okay, so how? So I think a lot of what people. So what is the like basically what is the role of like vanguardism and like what? How were they able to like? How did they handle counter revolution? Was it uh was it were they able to suppress the bourgeoisie or how did that work?
Yeah, I mean that's really what the Civil War was about. You had the White Army. really, which was it was a joint effort by the reactionary elements of the revolution. So you had like the liberals, the social democrats, all these people that didn't want to move to like a communist, society, a socialist society. They wanted to, utilize capitalism. They, kind of saw sort of aspirations of other parts of Europe as a good stepping stone from feudalism. And so, they essentially, the Bolsheviks were able to beat them back and retain power. It was a brutal war, but that is and Trotsky actually writes about this. I'm not like the biggest fan of him, but he writes about the permanent revolution that there's constantly going to be reactionary elements that arise from society constantly, and something that the vanguard needs to be concerned with is identifying those and beating them down.
All right. So what? So with that said, what would you say were the ultimate successes of the Soviet Union, and what were kind of the downfalls or the mistakes you
hmm
would say?
I mean, clearly, I mean, one of the I really think the ways in which the Soviet Union was successful is some of the greatest feats in human history. They were able to take basically a backwards agrarian society and industrialize it in time that, was unforeseen anywhere in the world. The one thing that people have to remember, I think, and it's worth repeating, is that there was unaliving in every single country that industrialized, and so obviously that's not unique to the Soviet Union. However, what is unique to the Soviet Union is the time that they were able to industrialize. They became a nuclear superpower in like 30 years. They basically took people from really the totality of the countryside into cities. They mass urbanization. They built up the forces of production really quickly. They went to space. There were so many
Right.
inventions that came out of the Soviet Union. So, a lot of that stuff is actually like extremely impressive. It just gets overshadowed by really ideologically driven criticisms. So, and certainly there are criticisms of the Soviet Union. I
Right.
can
So I
get into
think
those.
kind of to address, like, I think you kind of know where I'm going. We'll know where I'm going with this one. But so, like,
Mhm.
you would kind of say, like, authoritarian socialism. So I think kind of along those lines, the words they'll use to describe you. But what would you
Yeah.
say was why did the Soviet Union send tanks to Hungary and Czechoslovakia to suppress like counter revolution? Like, what was the justification? Was that a bad thing?
Well, no, I mean, this is the role of every state has it within their nature to defend their society. You know what I mean? I mean, capitalism does that. Liberal democracies do that, largely through quest of imperialism and military operations in socialist countries. That is when a capitalist country takes sees a socialist country as an enemy. It's literally because they're trying to retain the wellspring of their revolution. And it's the same thing in socialist societies, really. They were trying to retain the progress and what they had created through their revolution. So I think it's actually really noble and the duty of every single society to beat back efforts to
All right.
reactionary elements or
Right.
bourgeois
So
elements of
things are
their
kind of getting a
country.
little dark, but there's an elephant in the room here.
Sure.
What is the deal with gulags?
Yeah, gulags they were used to defend the revolution. I think, certainly there can be criticisms made, and there should be criticisms made that they were over applied largely. They were labor camps. They were sort of holding units for individuals that the state had identified as enemies of the revolution, certainly enemies of the Soviet Union. And so that's really how they were utilized. They were I definitely think that they were overutilized. There was a little bit of paranoia going on. But you do have to take into context the Soviet Union and what they were dealing with. They were pretty much a war economy for like their entire existence. You had, Western efforts constantly to go in and undo everything they had built. So, there was a little bit of paranoia going on, I think. But, I think everybody would be paranoid, honestly, in that situation. So yeah.
Okay, so what was the role of what role did Lenin play in all this? Like, what was he
hmm
doing during this whole period? Like, I guess if you can kind of break down not the whole history of him, but like kind of like his involvement in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, he's really the theoretical father of the Bolsheviks. I mean, he's the theoretical father of Marxism Leninism. A lot of the theories that uh, really all of them that MLs today hold, whether they're like Maoist tinted
Well, what specifically
or
did
otherwise.
sorry, but I was gonna say what specifically did Lenin bring? Like what separates just a basic Marxist from a Marxist Leninist?
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say definitely his analysis of imperialism. There wasn't really a good theory of imperialism. There's like Kautsky's at the time, but it was pretty weak and not really true. What Lenin brought was an analysis of capitalism as it was entering into the 20th century, and revolutionary tactics, certain that he utilized throughout the revolution that ended up being successful. So things like his theory of imperialism, that capitalism is essentially going to enter into a stage where it needs to export capital and export financial capital, is was new, and is something that still holds today. So we wouldn't have a coherent theory of imperialism if it wasn't for Lenin. And he led the revolution. He was basically the figurehead for it. So
What do you think about like when people say that, basically Stalin sent a bunch, sent, millions of people to their, deaths at these, gulags? What do you say to people who say that?
I mean, he definitely did send people to their deaths. I mean, that's a brutal truth of the Soviet Union. But again, that is literally every society. Every society unalives people that they think are enemies of the state,
Oh, you can
whether they're
you don't
domestic
have
or
to
abroad.
censor. I made a decision that you don't
Okay.
have to censor as long as you're not like
Oh, okay.
advocating. So go ahead.
At this point, the problem is I've already incorporated TikTok language
I
into
mean, it's
my
up to you. I'm
everyday.
just
So
saying if it slips, it
yeah.
slips. I think we have that freedom
Okay,
still.
cool.
So, but go ahead.
Um,
Unless you're done.
you know, certainly a lot of people were unalived through the conditions of the gulags. They were pretty brutal, of course. I think something that we have to contend with is the fact that really the Soviet Union was in a state of revolution for most of its existence, certainly the whole Stalin's
Right.
period.
Hmm.
If you look at all the enemies that they were dealing with, they were constantly dealing with enemies who I think there is justification for unaliving. Like there is like obviously people that, if they're trying to destroy your society, there really aren't any other options. Now,
Right.
certainly a lot of the people that were sent there were out of a irrational paranoia that Stalin fell into throughout his reign, and that's bad, and we can condemn that. But
So, right.
yeah.
What would you say was the series of events that kind of led to the ultimate collapse of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So after Stalin, after he unalived or died or whatever, there was some key figures that took over after him. Khrushchev followed after him and really tried to undo a lot of what Stalin did. There was like an effort to de-Stalinize, open up society to be able to criticize the state, undo a lot of the economic policies that he implemented. And progressively, what you see over everybody that follows Stalin was kind of a trajectory towards liberalizing. And interestingly enough, the standard of living did not increase from these efforts to liberalize and open up the market and this kind of stuff. And the people didn't even want it. If you look even into the late 80s into the early 90s, like they literally had like polls, about, should we stay socialist or should we kind of open up completely our economy to capitalism? The majority of people in the Soviet Union did not. They wanted to retain socialism. So really, the collapse of the Soviet Union was like an illegal, dictatorial decision. So yeah, I think the efforts to liberalize were actually a mistake that ultimately led to the demise.
So, like, how involved was like Western capitalist nations involved in the undermining of like? Do you know like of any meaningful ways they undermined the Soviet Union? I mean, because there was a Cold War, obviously, but
Yeah.
just to
Yeah.
elaborate
I
on that.
mean, well, I mean, constantly, there were constant efforts back and forth, right, from the Soviet Union to the West and from the West to the Soviet Union to undermine everything they did, sow discord within the party and within the society, make it seem like create this mythology of the West that people were just like living in abundance at all times, and there was this, massive difference between the standard of living of the people in the Soviet Union and in the West. Um, there was obviously trade embargoes placed on key Soviet allies. There was literally a war fought with Vietnam, one of the Soviet Union's allies. So constantly. I mean, the whole role of like the end of the 20th century of the United States was literally just to undermine the budding hegemonic power of the Soviet Union. And they were terrified of, yeah. So
Okay,
I
so
think I've
last
ran out
question,
of
I
time with
guess,
that.
like, I guess it's kind of like the Soviet Union. Like, why do you like people kind of argue? Well, like in Germany when it was split in half, people were fleeing to the west, were fleeing to the United States like occupied zone, and not they were running away from communism. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, again, what ended up happening is that, after Stalin died, they kept trying to do this sort of middle ground between liberalizing their economy and keeping a more command plan-based economy. It actually led to a lot of waste and a lot of inefficiency. So there was a lot of people that were going without the things that they needed. Um, and then, you have the West, kind of like pushing this propaganda. And certainly, coming out of the war period, like the United States was integral in rebuilding the world. So there was a big um, boom there. So people were kind of seeing the living standards in the West improving. And then you have the liberalizing efforts of the Soviet Union that are causing a decline. And so, of course, any good Marxist will say, unfortunately, it's true. The West had better material conditions towards the end of the Soviet Union. So it's only rational for people to want to go where it's better, and that's just the truth. So
All
this
right,
is what happened.
so that about wraps up that topic. I think we talked about a lot.
Cool.
So we're gonna we're kind of like doing a trip around the world. So why
Okay.
is this like off?
Awesome.
It's like off after I plant. Well, I didn't like. You know why it's off? Because I wasn't like. Because when I set it up, there wasn't two boxes. That's why. But it's okay.
All
All right.
right. Makes
So I
sense.
think again, this is, there's some people in the chat that are really not gonna like this, especially. Um, but I think like I'm just kind of dispel and talk about all these countries. So
Sure.
how did how did their socialist revolution occur? Like what were the material
Yeah.
conditions and how did it happen? Why were they successful?
hmm So leading up to the Cuban Revolution, there was essentially like a U.S. backed dictator named Batista. He was sort of ruling over Cuba to the dismay of a lot of Cuban society. Really what ended up happening is he had turned Cuba into, and this is of course what America wanted. It basically became an outpost for the interests of U.S. imperialism. And from that, you had again another sort of similar to the Soviet Union, a budding sort of vanguard group of revolutionaries who, saw kind of what was happening, the material conditions that Cuban people were dealing with, and they started organizing the working class to overthrow this. And obviously, the big figureheads in that, Castro and Guevara, they were able to lead like a successful guerrilla warfare campaign to overthrow the Batista regime, and they did, and it was successful. And so that's kind of how the Socialist Republic of Cuba got established initially.
Oh, sorry, I forgot I was muted there. All right. So we touched on that. What was the role of Che Guevara? What was his
Yeah, yeah,
how did
yeah.
he drive revolution? And also, real quick, like also about Che Guevara, um, kind of just because I know people say he was kind of like I think it was what racist, sexist, So what do you say to that? Like, so kind of explain like who Che Guevara was and what he did for his role in the revolution.
Yeah, sure. Well, so I mean, he was, really, he was like tasked with, and he really led like the guerrilla warfare in Cuba, which was really integral to their victory. I mean, they're dealing with essentially what is a U.S. outpost, U.S. military outpost. So they have to get really creative with the ways that they're combating, this U.S. aided military. So, he kind of directed the guerrilla warfare um, of the Cuban Marxist revolutionaries. And so he led them to victory essentially. They're the interesting thing about Cuba is they're not really super like theoretically. There's not a lot of like introductions of like Marxist theory from Cuba. I mean, they took a lot of, really all of their influence from the Soviet Union ideologically, but the biggest thing is going to be the utilization of guerrilla warfare that was ultimately successful. So, him and Castro led the revolution essentially.
So, I guess again, like this kind of be a common question. So, in what ways did communism, socialism improve material conditions under Castro?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, really, we also have to preface this by saying that, pretty much immediately after the establishment of the Socialist Republic of Cuba, the U.S. placed an embargo on their economy, so they were not able to trade with any of the U.S.'s allies. And if they did, essentially, there was a penalty that was given to any of their trade partners. So they had to really pretty much rely on the Soviet Union and Soviet allies for everything. All of their trade had to go through them, even taking into consideration that, which by the way, that embargo is still on them to this day, and they're able to retain power and not collapse. They're able to increase literacy rates tenfold. They were able to, create some of the most like proliferating and prolific healthcare in the region. I mean, they literally export their doctors to other countries to aid. They were able to provide healthcare for all the people there and really, construct an economy that's dealing with this harsh embargo by the West and able to become ultra efficient in the way that they're distributing their resources. So a lot of like really creative things came out of the Cuban situation.
Right. So, sorry.
Very good.
So, if Cuba was so great, why did people come over on rafts to come to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, really, this is going to be kind of a recurring theme, is this was a concerted effort by the West to undermine the success of and the potential of the Cuban Revolution. They saw Cuba as essentially a influential outpost of the Soviet Union. The embargo was brutal. People, I mean, things had to be rationed, essentially. I mean, that's just the logical conclusion of that. You're cut off from essentially the entire world to get anything. Obviously, people are going to go without things, unfortunately. So, people, and of course, then you had the establishment of, the U.S. taking in any Cuban refugees, right? So if anybody was able to step foot on American soil, they immediately became U.S. citizens. This was obviously, an ideology of the U.S. to undermine and continue to undermine. So it's really just, imagine Cuba if they didn't have an embargo on them, really, you know.
Can you explain, I guess, more in depth? Like, can you explain like the Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance? Like, what was the deal there? Like, why did why did Russia put missiles in Cuba?
Well, I mean, you just have to think about it from a geopolitical standpoint. Cuba is essentially facing the United States. There was the Cold War. We actually got really close to on both sides using nuclear weapons. So obviously, the Soviet Union saw it as a strategic point to station missiles on Cuban soil, and obviously the U.S., which I think is rational of the U.S., saw that as an escalation and threat from the Soviet Union and Soviet Union's allies. So that created a crisis, of course. But again, we kind of see everything through the lens of the interests of the West and of the United States. Whereas essentially the United States would have done exactly the same thing if, and I know we'll get to Russia and Ukraine, but you know, they do try to build allies and with enemies on Russia's border. So That is really that's kind of the long and short of that.
Um, I don't know if I really have too many more questions on this, but well, I guess we could talk specifically about like why, like, uh, for instance, like they say like the literacy rate shot up. Like, what was the meaning for
Mhm.
that? Like, how did they get the literacy rate to shoot up like that?
Yeah, so these are just like so health, both healthcare and literacy in Cuba. This is really just the what you can do when you have a planned economy, when you have an economy that has to bend to the will of the state itself and not to, these
So
amorphous market
are
mechanisms.
Cuba's doctors forced to work?
They're not. They get sent on assignments throughout the world, forced to work. Like everyone's kind of forced to work. And I do, probably want to get out and say I think if anybody can work, if somebody can work, I actually think that they should. So,
Right.
whether that's like, you're forced by the market or you're forced by the state, like everybody's forced to work, everybody's forced to labor. So,
Well, like, do you think like the doctors actually just find the job rewarding
of
anyway?
course, I think
Like,
everybody.
yeah.
Mhm. Well, I
Okay.
think everybody finds what they do rewarding at a base line. I think really um, the difficulties and complications of the market and capitalism is kind of what drives people away from finding fulfillment in what they do. So,
So why is it? This might be a misguided question. You might spell this, but why is it so hard to eat? Like, why is there such like a problem with like the black market and beef and like what is all that? Like, why is there an issue with black market if there's enough food for everybody to eat? Like,
well, there are complications with being able to acquire enough food for everybody. Obviously, that's not, because of a lack of will or a lack of desire from the Cuban state. It's because, again, it's literally is because of the embargo. I mean, think about it. Like you're literally not able to trade with the majority of the world, and under Trump, this has only gotten worse. It was a little bit lessened under Obama, and coincidentally enough, living standards in Cuba arose as soon as the embargo was loosened. As soon as it was tightened, then you have, of course, as you can probably imagine, living standards for Cubans worsened. So when you're not able to get the resources you need from a globalized society, then obviously what's going to fill that is black markets where people are kind of capitalizing off of that. But these things don't naturally emerge. They don't emerge out of a vacuum, right? These are sort of fabrications of enemies.
okay, well, I think I don't really have many questions on this one, but I guess I can get because China is kind of a big topic because there's a lot there. Um,
Hmm.
so I'm gonna we'll switch over to China. I know some people are excited about this, and this is kind of just a
Okay.
blank sort of like idea of what we like a guiding sort of principle to question here.
Cool.
So I guess like we'll kind of start with the Cultural Revolution. So like how did Mao gain so much power and gain so much like I mean Chinese people love Mao. What
Yeah.
about him was so like how did he get there?
Okay. Well, I mean, again, all these people, Castro, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, these people were, large figureheads in revolutions that brought people out of really harsh, exploitive circumstances. That was the same when we're looking at the civil war in China, the Chinese nationalists were brutal. The landlords in China were brutal. They were extremely exploitative. People were, essentially not able to own anything. They had no freedom. And so people see Mao as a liberator. They see him as the head of a liberatory movement that brought them from something that was objectively harsh and difficult to live in. So yeah, I think, and by the way, we see this in America too, right? The way that we see our revolutionaries is really exactly the way that people in China see Mao, the Maoist revolution. There, he is their George Washington, essentially. So
Okay. All right. So what was the Cultural Revolution? Like
yeah, sure. So this was kind of a effort to reassert his dominance You know, after the Great Leap Forward, which, kind of wasn't as successful as he would have liked, there was an effort to sort of remobilize and reinvigorate the spirit of the Chinese Revolution. And essentially, what this meant is that it was sort of a mass mobilization of loyalists, of people, of segments of society that still believed in the revolution, to kind of beat down a little bit on some of the reactionary and revisionist elements, mainly in universities, for people that wanted to sort of like reverse the some of the progress and some of the mistakes that were made under Mao's rule, to go to more liberal kind of Western um, uh, model.
Think so. First, I guess first part of this is like, was the this great famine, like, is that on Mao's shoulder, and like, was famine really unique at the
Mhm.
time? Like, was this,
So,
is it socialism that caused the famine?
I don't think it's socialism. I think it's definitely it is largely on Mao. The decisions that he made in the Great Leap Forward, they were bad. They were not good
Well, just
decisions.
for this,
Yeah.
because I like I kind of have a basic knowledge. Like, are you kind of referring to like struggle sessions and stuff? Like, what were his big mistakes that caused all this
Um, some
chaos?
some of the agricultural policies that he decided to utilize. I mean, we have to think about kind of, they weren't really harvesting a lot of food anyway. They really weren't trying to utilize um, sort of desperate measures. And Mao really had desires to become ultra efficient, and so he kind of got a little bit creative with some of the methods he used. They weren't scientific, and really they were kind of rooted in like a vibe really of his, which I think was really stupid. And they ended up being really bad, honestly, of course. And so yeah, so a lot of like the backyard steel things that they led to more waste than product, and killing like the pests. Really there was of course the famous thing of killing the pests in the fields, and he thought that that would actually produce more. And granted, it actually had an adverse reaction, and so yeah, you know.
Would you say like the Maoist experiment was successful, or would you say it kind of flopped?
Well, I think, you know, China would not be what it is today without the Maoist revolution. And I think that's why it is actually so valuable. Certainly, there was a litany of mistakes made under Mao's rule. We can recognize that. And it's actually really important for Marxists to recognize places where we've gone wrong. I think we're certainly better at doing that than like liberals and capitalists and stuff. But if you look at China today, it would not be like what it is if it wasn't for the policies that Mao put into motion, the efforts that some of the wins of Mao's China was the rapid industrialization, the sort of copied the Stalinist 5-year plan that led to building up the forces of production in China, which did lead to, the ability to mass produce things, and did lead ultimately to an increase in the standard of living, and going from a mostly agrarian society to a, great industrialized one. So.
So I don't know if you think you answered it enough, but I was kind of gonna ask, what was that? Something just, sorry, my phone's dinging. Sorry. Uh, so I guess I think you kind of touched on it, like how China how did China like the transition from Maoist to like what it is today, and we're gonna go more in depth on that. But
Mhm.
like, how did that happen? What series of events led to like sort of where we are now?
Yeah. So, essentially, you had a couple people that took over China
Sorry about all that dinging.
after, no, you're good. After Mao died. And probably the one that people know the most is Deng, right? Deng Xiaoping. He took over after Mao, and he sort of like began to introduce market reforms into China, started to reverse some of the mass collectivization campaigns that happened. And so they begin to sort of liberalize their economy. They begin to like open up things a little bit for internal critiques, and some of like the more like liberal ideas of freedom of speech and this kind of stuff. So that was the beginning of the reform era, essentially, from like I think the late 70s to the early 90s. And then you had like the socialism. There's like this phrase like socialism with Chinese characteristics.
So
And so re-
is China
Mhm.
a socialist or communist country?
You know, people get mad at me about this. I think that it is certainly communist. I mean, but my understanding of communism, my analysis of communism is that again, it's not these like ideas that we set
You're
into
talking
motion.
about, so just so we're clear, you're talking about modern China.
Yeah, I do think
Okay.
that it's ruled and governed under the philosophy of communism, under the movement of
I have
communism.
to restore a phone.
But-
Sorry about
Oh no, you're good.
that.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think people have this idea that like communism is, you know, you have to check. It's like a checklist you're going through. Oh, I gotta be classist, moneyless. That's not what it is. That's like a misunderstanding of Marx. It's a movement that abolish. It's the movement. We're in the movement that seeks to abolish the present state of things. And China is still committed to that. If you look at, you know, the plans that they have for the next 20, 30 years, they plan to be fully socialist in like 20 years. So yeah, I think, you know, do they utilize elements of capitalism? They do, of course. Nobody's going to deny that, but that doesn't, I don't think, negate the movement of communism.
Gotcha. So I was just fixing my volume settings so we don't have to deal with that.
You're good.
All good. All good. Just yeah, I gotta. I don't know. I'll tell you about what I gotta talk about later when we're just chilling. But anyway, uh, we're still in China here.
Hmm.
Um, so I'm not gonna lie. I'm kind of like a China fanboy right now. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's talk like this. So this might go a little off. I, I think I'm running a little ahead, so we can sort of dive off into this. So
Okay.
like, why is China so based?
Yeah. Well, for a lot of reasons, you know. One, you know, I think Xi, you know, I think he's making a lot of the right moves. For one, you know, he has a big campaign to weed out corruption. You know, I think he's purged like thousands of officials within the party who have been identified as being corrupted by, you know, like a desire of greed, of accumulating power and this kind of thing. So people have been kicked out of the party. He was able to centralize power, which I think is important. You know, I think that is actually one of the biggest advantages of China is that they are so tightly centralized, and it so allows them. Well, I'll get into this a little bit later. Allows them to be very agile in a lot of the moves that they make. You know, in an era where like the rest of everyone else's economies are like shrinking and slowing down, China's been able to really fend that off a lot better. Um, you know, some of the foreign policy moves that they've made, I think, have been really, really wise. You know, they're building up the forces of production in other countries, and you know, building soft power in this way to sort of compete with Western hegemony. And really, you know, they're leading the way in technology. They're leading the way. They're building. You know, like in America and the West, we're not building anymore. We don't build shit. We export this abstract, fictitious capital. We export like culture and media. We don't like build anything anymore. China, they build to build even. Sometimes they build and they demolish everything because they're like, yeah, we didn't actually really need that. We just kind of were, you know, we just kind of wanted to build it. So I think that's based. People say, well, that's wasteful or whatever. I think it's cool that they build just to build. They build to you know continue to you know flex their economy, flex the fact that they are productive still. So I think that's great. They're one of the few economies that's still actually like mass producing everything. And yeah. So.
Okay, so I guess I was gonna ask also like, is what China is doing in the global South? Would you is that considered imperialism?
You know, it's not considered imperialism because, you know, they're not building up these societies in an effort to accumulate the capital within them. They're building up these societies in a way to like exercise soft power, and they're not doing these in like an exploitive way. You know, if you look at the agreements between the countries that they're like I guess mostly in Africa, really. You know, the deals are not exploitative. It's not colonization. They're not like occupying these countries and you know feeding resources back to their home country or something. You know, it's just all it is just building up hegemonic power by building favor with these countries are building up their forces of production, which nobody else is doing. And in fact, it's quite the opposite with the West. They're just like exploiting and sucking resources away from them. China's injecting resources into these countries, helping them build up their societies. So I think it's kind of the opposite of imperialism, really. And like a goal of communism is to spread the revolution. So people call that red imperialism. It just kind of makes me think they don't know what imperialism is. So
I keep forgetting I'm muted. How did
no, you're good.
what does China do with like corrupt corporations?
Yeah, so that's like one of my favorite things. So, and this is why I will say that they are communists, or the state is it's motivated by the interest of the workers of the masses, really. Is that anytime you have so what, and I think a reason why this is like should be said that um, a lot of key industries in China are actually they're nationalized, so they fall under the complete command of the state itself. They allow capital to function as long as it's subservient to the interest of the state. So what that means is anytime one of these capitalists, right, they allow them to sort of function under this idea of new democracy and this kind of thing, they literally take them out back and they, pew pew them in the head, and I think that's based. I think that's something that, that we don't see. We see the opposite of, in the Western world, which is we allow these people to essentially rule with an iron fist over everybody. Everybody lives in this subjugated, despotic existence. China says if you begin to act in like a greedy, self-edifying, self-serving way, we're going to take you out because you have to be. They have a big focus on social cohesion and harmony and this kind of stuff. So
Well, I guess
yeah.
like what do you
So if
think about?
capital is going to,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Finish. Go ahead. Finish.
well, it's just that I'll land my plan. Like if capital is going to function in a country, it should be subservient to the interests of the working class, and I think this Chinese state makes sure that it is.
So, I have a few questions, obviously, but does like when you say like all these great things about China, and someone says, well, they're 98% Han Chinese, what do you say to that? Like, do you
Mhm.
think like there's some sort of element of cultural cohesion and racial identity or nationality, or do you think it's not has anything to do with that?
I think what that is like people who are majority on like the ultra right wing, they see the successes of China, and they don't want to have to like accept the fact that the successes of China are born out of the principles of socialism.
Right.
So they try to look for reasons that actually, instead of like asserting the truth and the effectiveness of socialism, it actually serves to like justify their politics. So they say, well, the only reason China is successful is because it's like ethnically homogenous, which, you know, it is mostly Han Chinese, but there are like different ethnicities in China. But it's kind of irrelevant. The reason why China is successful is because it's able to be agile within its economy and address a lot of the issues that the West is not able to address to maneuver out of recessions. Like that doesn't have anything to do with the ethnic makeup of the country. This is just like haphazardly trying to apply like ideology to a country that's leading the way in society. So.
Okay. So, what is like what does like homelessness look like in China? How is that dealt with?
I mean, it virtually doesn't exist. And by the way, this is not just something that is in
Well,
China.
that's Chinese propaganda, so you're gonna have
Oh, right. Okay, my bad.
to. Yeah, but just
Well,
please
I mean,
explain it if you can.
sure, I mean, because well, and I did want to say quickly, like even in like a ostensibly, I guess, compared to America, poor country like Cuba, still homelessness is relatively non-existent. Um, and the reason why is because when you have an economy that's governed by the principles of socialism, that's governed by planning, you're able to more equitably distribute like social necessities like housing. So these things, they don't end up falling into the asset portfolio of State Street or, Vanguard or BlackRock or whatever, they're not assets to speculate on. Houses are used for the utility that they were made for, which is to live in. So, the state is able to guarantee non-exploitive, loans for the homes that the people are able to purchase. There's not this like usury driven uh, system that we have in the West, right, where profit is it's just like value and profit seeking. Utility is the driving principle of the distribution of housing.
What do you think, like, how good is their medical insurance? Like, do people there like it, or is it kind of like bare minimum? Like, what is it like, if you know?
Yeah, so they have the healthcare admittedly is a lot better in the cities than it is in the rural countryside.
Yeah, I think
We have
they
to
admitted they
remember,
have a lot of issues out in like the more agrarian parts. But
yeah,
sorry for interrupting.
yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead. Go ahead.
And again, like this is something that is a pro is like a really great thing about the China or really like socialist economies is they recognize where they are lacking, and they have a concerted effort to address that. And they have, if you look at healthcare in the rural countryside, over the past couple of decades, it has gotten better. It needs to get better, but it has gotten better, right? But largely everybody that lives in the urban centers has healthcare, is able to, I had a friend actually that he like went and taught in China, and he went in to get like some of his teeth filled or whatever, and it was like he actually had to get a lot of them filled because he didn't have access to dental in the United States. So, he kind of left there being sort of like anxious, like, oh shit, man, this is going to be really fucking expensive. Ended up costing him like the equivalent of like 20 American dollars, and he was
Right.
just like, this is like, so yeah, so
What's
it's
the?
not like, yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead and finish your thought there.
Well, it's not like fully socialized in the totality of the country, but it's heavily subsidized to the point where it's like, a very low cost for the vast majority of Chinese citizens.
Yeah. So I'm kind of all over the place. I kind of forgot about some of these questions. I kind of rushed here. But what was the? Because I know I brought it up briefly before, and what's the deal with Tiananmen Square? Did people get run over by tanks? Like, what happened?
Well, if we ask DeepSeek about this, they would tell us the truth. Now, obviously Tiananmen Square did happen. I think really what ended up happening, and this is something that I don't have a problem saying was a mistake, is that following the Great Leap Forward, there was a large part of the sort of student base and the intelligentsia that felt like um, the Maoist revolution was unsuccessful, or that it was leading China to like lose some of the material gains that were made from industrializing. And so there were like revolutionary, uh, like sort of like pockets that were coming up in order to try to liberalize, and so I think Mao sort of panicked a little bit, and there was some squashing down on things that I think people should be allowed to do. I think it's important and actually a part of Mao's philosophy to go and listen to the grievances of the people and try to rectify those actually and to rectify this. It's the duty of the party to rectify those. Even I would go as far to say. So, um, you know, there were things that happened that were bad and that we can learn from. Certainly, I think that's one of them. So, yeah.
And what's like, what is the fundamental problem that China and Taiwan are sort of dealing with? And like, in your view, is Taiwan China, or is Taiwan its own sovereign nation?
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is certainly China. I mean, it's under the sphere. If we look at a lot of these like conflicts, right, throughout the world, where you have some what is ostensibly like a U.S. outpost is trying to claim, a desire to be sovereign. Um, you know, the way that I analyze this stuff is under like spheres of influence, and I'll kind of go over this a little bit more, I think, when we get to Russia, Ukraine. But Taiwan is under the Chinese sphere of influence. And so really it should be China. It is China. And the only reason why there is any conflict going on at all, and you see these schisms and this desire to become a ridiculous independent state away from China, is because there is it's implanted by the West, that because it wants to have influence in Taiwan. Really, it wants the fruit of Taiwanese society to be subsumed now into Western economy and political as well.
I
The
guess the
U.S. is
last
able to
question is
gain
like,
that.
what do you say to like, you know, what's the deal with like, I mean, you said they like to build, but like, ghost cities and the housing bubble. Like, is China in trouble? Like, is China getting beat by the United States in any way in this tariff war? Like,
No.
what's going on? Like,
No, 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 no. Anything that's being said about the U.S. gaining ground on China is literally just propaganda. It's just ideology. The Chinese economy is outperforming the U.S. in like literally every single metric. They do build, and they overbuild. A lot of times they like overaccumulate, um, uh, like construction essentially. And so, sometimes they'll, everything is sort of determined by inputs and outputs. And so they'll say, oh, well, we have this land, we can sort of develop it. And, it would be nice if people maybe moved out here to, start developing this land out here instead of sort of concentrating into some of the urban centers. Sometimes that doesn't pan out, and so they see that there isn't really a demand for that, so they demolish it, and then, but I don't know why that's
so
so common of a critique. I think that's actually kind of cool, and kind of I wish that we did that in the West. It's like impossible to build
yeah, it is.
anything here anymore. So
Does China have a social credit score to exist in society?
a lot of that is like Western propaganda. I mean, they definitely track people's um, they again, you have to take into consideration they're culturally different from the West. So a big thing in China is like harmony, is that throughout the totality of society, it's very harmonious. People don't feel like, and this is also embedded in the mass line, right? Is that people don't have large grievances with the state. So it's essentially just a metric that China uses to gauge how satisfied people are with the state, and that's basically measured by public grievances that they have, or public demonstrations, or this kind of thing. America has this too. America has this financially as well. I mean, we have credit here, which bars people from being able to acquire housing and jobs and this kind of thing. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. A lot of the things that like the West criticizes China for end up being just projections of some of the most egregious things that we have here. So yeah,
All right. Well, we're about to pivot topics. I'm kind of like, I really am using the 2 hours as a loose framework, by the way. So, I just want to say, like, guys, if you're enjoying this, we still got a lot to go, and I think it's gonna get I think it's gonna get way better, and I think Amir, I'm enjoying this. I think the people
yeah,
here,
absolutely.
I see the commies doing the purity argument, and the I see them arguing about shit in the comments. I love it.
Oh
Um,
no, okay,
yeah,
yeah,
they're
happy
some of
to.
them
I'm
like
glad I'm
are
getting.
they're very mad. Some of them are mad that you think China's socialist and communist or whatever. I think
Yeah, I know that one always makes people
yeah.
mad. I kind of
So
look forward to
yeah.
yeah,
So if you're down there, please look, put it on your story. Please share it out. Get those likes going. I mean, first of all, gift Emir because I mean, he's just talking. I hope he has water over there. Um,
yeah. No, I know. I'm just yapping, but
yeah, I mean,
like
this
I
is
have a
what I
gift
wanted.
with the
Like, I just
gas.
wanted to
So
let you yap because I feel like all the time you're like kind of confined to like these like 1 minute sort of comments if you're lucky.
debate
So
spaces. I know. It is funny. Like a common critique people always have is like you're monologuing, you're monologuing. I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, my bad. But
right.
yeah. So yeah. So what's the next? Is the next topic literally going to be about
It's about to get a
critiques of the
no
left?
no well that's the last one. So I think
Okay. Cool. Cool.
things are
Cool.
about to get a little more hot. We got the last four top. I mean, we got Russia and NATO next. And then we
Oh.
got
Okay.
Palestine. We got Zog,
Oh, my
and then we
favorite
got Red
subject.
Fact, and then we're gonna talk about Red Faction.
Okay.
So I
Cool.
think Red Faction will cover. I'm just gonna let you loose on Red Faction and just kind of
Okay.
because
Yeah. And I will.
that'll address your
Mhm.
critique of the left there. So
Cool. Yeah.
yeah, so let's So I think like a lot of people on the left also this position might piss them off too. So like so the next topic will be we'll talk generally about Russia and Ukraine. I thought it would be relevant to also talk about NATO. Um, so do you think do you think Russia is the bad guy?
Um, so look, listen, I don't like stan Russia as it exists today. Obviously, I think, it is essentially like an oligarchy. It's an authoritarian capitalist country. So is it the bad guy? I don't know if it's really useful to think of like geopolitics in terms of like morals or good guy, bad guy necessarily all the time. I think that Russia is largely like an evil country, but I think that a lot of the things that they do are deeply rational. A lot of the decisions that they make geopolitically are deeply rational, for the interests of their like their national interests, really. And I think, yeah, so that's what I would say about Russia. I don't like to defend them, but I get where they're coming from a lot of the time. You know what I mean?
These questions might not be that important, but like, do you think Russia actually has a legitimate claim to like the Donbas region or any of this? Do you think like they have any justification in your mind for invasion?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I think this kind of goes back to the fact that Ukraine is under the sphere of influence of Russia. It just is. Do I think that Ukraine should exist? I think it should exist. But Ukraine it's always been Russia. It's literally always been Russia, until very recently. And like an example I like to use is like, imagine that like Mexico was trying to enter into a strategic alliance with like China or something like that. In the same way that Ukraine is, trying to enter into a strategic alliance with the United States. United States is like the, historic enemy of Russian society. So, we would literally do exactly the same thing in Mexico as Russia is doing in Ukraine. You have to look at the fundamental kernel underpinning why they're invading. They're invading really to drive away the encroaching, ghost of Western influence, which is embodied in NATO. So I don't know if I went over my time there, but I think fundamentally Ukraine is under
Going
Russia's
this
sphere of
way.
influence, so they essentially have to make sure that that continues, right? And so I think it's, again, this is like a deeply calculated, rational action.
Well, so as a socialist, like, what do you think the United States' role is in this, though? Like, what should they be doing?
What do I think they should be doing, or what do I think they
No, I
are
think
doing?
like it, like based on, I guess, like your ideological perspective, like, what do you like, what do you think? Like, how do you think the president of the United States should handle? I know you're not like an expert, but how do you think
Mhm.
they should handle the situation? Like, should we just stop funding it all, or what?
Well, ideally, I would love for us to not have any influence um, in Eastern Europe at all. I don't think we have any business there. And really, what we try to do fundamentally, if you look at the history of the United States, is we try to, coerce and influence countries around the world who, are not liberal. They're illiberal countries. Russia is an illiberal country. That's how they've pretty much always been throughout their entire existence. That's how they currently are now. We try to influence them and the countries around them to be liberal, to basically become copy and paste the bus. And that's certainly what the effort is, in Ukraine, the, effort to sort of uh, absorb them into NATO is just a way to extend Western hegemony into Eastern Europe, make them into liberal democracy. And so we shouldn't do that. We should like let these countries have the ability to self-determine how they want to run their own societies.
So
Um,
you see NATO as
yeah,
more than just like a defensive alliance?
yeah. No, NATO is an expression of Western power. Um, it's sort of, what you see a lot of times in the West is like a lot of the actions politically, geopolitically, and otherwise, they are like underpinned by ideology, and then they're justified with like pretext. So, the pretext of NATO is, this like protective alliance. What it actually is just a way to consolidate power of the West and just exercise that throughout the world, um, justified by like these moral implications that don't actually exist because we don't even follow them ourselves. So, when you see, say for instance, like Georgia trying to become part of the EU, you see Ukraine trying to become a part of NATO. What this is it's just the West trying to gain some sort of geopolitical or hegemonic power around countries that are fundamentally illiberal and opposed to like Western power.
Okay, interesting. Interesting stuff. Yeah, I thought that was. I kind of. I mean, I think we talked briefly about your position, so I kind of knew ahead of time, but I figured I'd probe that.
Yeah, and a lot of people view this stuff in like a moral lens, like, well, Ukraine is being invaded,
Well,
and
is
that's like,
Zelensky, in your view, is he an authoritarian? Is he a dictator? Do they have
well,
a
he's,
Nazi problem? Like, all these sort of.
yeah, they definitely have a responsive problem, but I don't actually think that that's like important or necessary to the conflict or the political ramifications of the country. Like, I mean, Zelensky, even though, and here's the contradiction of the West, right? You have someone who's deeply corrupt, who essentially like shouldn't even be president if you look at the actual political history of how he even gained power. So this ostensibly should be counter to all of the all the principles that like we hold to be important, like democracy, transparency, accountability, like these kind of things. Yet we're allowing them, or we have a will for them to join NATO, which is like the political expression of the West. I mean, this is just like deeply, just like a contradictory to like what we say we want out of the countries that we ally with. And again, this is also just an example of the fact that these Eastern European countries they always have been and they still are deeply illiberal, and that's okay. That's how they should be because they should have the right to be able to self-determine that. But you have this desire to go and tell Ukraine to portray itself as like as expressing all of these Western ideas when it's not. And so obviously Russia is going to see this as sort of an act of geopolitical aggression. Like, why wouldn't they?
Well, you know what? I think we kind of addressed like I think the big points I want to get there. So but I also think like if I could dedicate an extra 5 minutes to this next topic, I won't really complain. Just before we do, I think this one like we might have to censor a little bit because it's about a certain group. So I think we should refer to them as H group, and we probably should just be very careful just because of the graphic content of what's going on. So just
Yeah,
maybe like
sure.
G
Yeah,
side,
I'll
G side,
mhm.
the whole spiel, just for the safety, so we don't get
TikTok
censored for the safety.
language.
Yeah, because
TikTok language on this
if we
one.
get
We're gonna
taken
yeah.
down, the whole recordings like I don't get the recording. I should have screen recorded it,
Yeah. No,
but yeah.
we'll put the bumpers up. We'll put the linguistic bumpers up for sure. No
Yes,
worries.
sir. All right. I think you know.
Yeah, okay. Let's go. One of my favorite subjects. I'm excited
So
about
I
this one.
guess like the simple, I think like because I obviously I don't know if anybody knows, but I advocate for this. Like I'm always yelling about this shit. Like I'm yelling at everybody
Yeah.
about this. I'm calling people names about this shit. So
Yep. Yep, sure.
so I guess the best way to start is just like explaining like, oh, we got a teacup. Are you with us? I want to talk while you're not.
My
You
bad.
good?
My bad.
All right, you're good.
I got a phone call. Yeah, I got a phone call, but
All right, we're good. So we were talking. We just started talking. We're gonna start talking about this. So I was saying the best way to go about this is probably just to go from the beginning, so to speak.
hmm
So
sure.
I think the best way would be like, how was the state of Israel? I'm going to combine two topics because I
hmm
kind of separated
hmm
like kind of the concept of Zionism from this, but I think we'll combine it. So kind of talk about it combined. But
Yeah.
I guess what did I say? What was I saying? Yeah, how did it begin? Like what started kind
hmm
of this like Arab Israeli conflict? How was Israel
Yep.
born?
Sure. Well, Israel was born out of the political expression will of the movement of Zionism, which, if we're looking at sort of the relevant author of Zionism, I mean, Zionism sort of predates Theodore Herzl, but fundamentally, the construction of the Zionist movement is like a fabrication of him. And if you read his own work, I mean, he
Oops.
really saw this as are we good?
No, no, the gifts distracted me. Thank you. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Go
Cool, cool,
ahead.
cool.
Sorry.
No, you're good. If we're looking at his own writings on the subject, he really wanted to do the Jewish version of European colonialism that had proliferated throughout the centuries leading up to the establishment of the state of Israel. He sort of looked around and saw all of these European Western states being constructed in Western Europe, like Australia, the United States, certainly, and he wanted that for the Jews. So there was a movement born out of that, funded by the early Zionist Council, which was sort of made up of a lot of the sort of very wealthy Jewish diaspora from mostly Western countries themselves. You had sort of a couple waves of what like is called Aliyah, which is when Jews make a like they essentially move from wherever they are in the diaspora to the state of Israel, that were actually led up to its founding even before it, the leading up into the 20th century. You had like the first and second wave the from Russia, and you had the formation of paramilitary groups, the Haganah, the Irgun, the Lehi. These groups were tasked with essentially going in and clearing the land of the people who lived there, while there was this idea that was being proliferated that that nobody lived there. It was a land for people without land, essentially, is what they said. And really, what was happening is they were ethnically cleansing the native people that were already living there, using these paramilitary groups, using the people who were coming from Western Europe, and so they were establishing a colonial state. It was the expression of Theo Herzl's fantasies of doing colonialism. And they had a couple ideas of where they wanted to do it. Fundamentally, they really wanted to do it in Palestine, so that is ultimately where they picked. So yeah.
Keep like getting a little distracted, but it records it, so we're good. But did you start? You touched on the Nakba or no?
Mhm.
Okay, you did.
Well,
Or
a little bit. I mean, yeah. I mean, the Nakba was essentially a campaign of ethnic cleansing from the armed militias, the organized Zionist um, groups, to through force and through threat of force, to clear the Palestinians from their villages.
I just realized it says a
Hmm.
discussion about the Israel and Palestine, but that's
About the
just
Israel and Palestine,
oh boy,
the Israel and Palestine.
just
Um,
just
Yeah,
gonna
and so it led to about 700,000 Palestinians being
just gonna
literally cleared from the land that they were native to.
you know what?
Um,
Just do that. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, you're good. You're good.
Just gonna plug the Discord then, since that one's
Yeah, let's go.
pretty
Join.
good.
Yeah, join his Discord for sure. Join his Discord.
All right,
So it's
go.
like, yeah, yeah. So 700,000 Palestinians were cleared during the Nakba. 300 villages were cleared as well through force, the utilization of force, and the threat of force. Um, they would hand out pamphlets. They would go in. They would, just violate and violently clear out villages. And then they would have people from that village go to the next village, hand out pamphlets, announce on megaphones that they were going to go in and forcibly clear these villages, with the threat of unaliving them. And so that led to 700,000 Palestinians being taken from the homes that they had been in for centuries. Literally, Palestinians in parts of the world still have the keys of the houses that they lived in pre-Nakba. So yeah, it's essentially just an act of colonialism that's unique to like the Jewish people.
Gotcha. So, so do the so I guess that's kind of one question we could tie it together. Do the events of October 7th justify the entire IDF response?
Absolutely not. No. And I mean, look, there is like a sort of like socio-psychological concept that I think is really true and relevant, which is called blowback. Essentially, what that means is, you have responses oftentimes violent responses. We can look at one that nobody has objection to, which is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, of people who are subjugated, constantly oppressed by, a group or a country or whatever that's, much more powerful than them, really holding them under their political boot for a very long time, not allowing them to actualize freedom, be sovereign in the lands that they live in for decades and decades and decades and decades. This is oftentimes, psychologically and politically expressed through violent means, through violent uprising. And I think a really good comparison to October 7th is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. If you look at the conditions that Palestinians in Gaza were living in, it's essentially an open air prison. Israel controls every single mode of transportation. They're not able to go from Gaza to the West Bank, which is illegally occupied. They're not able to have that, like, have access to their own water, their own electricity. Israel controls all of the resources that come in to the point where they say, they control how many calories each Gazan is allowed to consume. That's not even like joking. That's actually
Yeah.
for real. So yeah, I mean, essentially these people are ruled with an iron fist, and that's going to cause ramifications.
Well, did the I mean these people here in Palestine, they elected H group. So, you know, what do you say to that?
But yes, they did. What we do also have to keep in mind is that like H group is like it's much more than the Al Qassam brigades that like carried out October 7th. The armed militia that carried out October 7th is like a a like part of H group, but H group is really it's militarized, it's also political, it's also administrative. Um, so it's a legitimate political party in Gaza. They had one election, they won by a plurality. It wasn't even the majority. And at the time, Age Group was seen as like a political party. They were seen as like a mutual aid organization. They were actually, and people are gonna not like that I said, they were doing a lot of good things in Gaza at the time. They were actually getting people some modicum of healthcare, some modicum of resources. They were, constructing schools and this kind of thing. So obviously, the people of Gaza are going to see this as maybe a possibility of some semblance of a standard of living. Then one election, 20 years ago, and essentially Israel has used this as justification to punish them ever since, completely unevenly and yeah. So I mean
So,
that's
is Israel like when Israel talks about what H group does? Do you think they're big? Do you think they're hypocrites?
yeah, of course. Everything that Israel accuses Palestine and yeah, well, they accuse it.
Yeah.
This
So
is
let's
it falls on the totality.
yeah go
Yeah.
ahead and break down like all of the common ones you hear and kind of debunk like common myths
Okay. Yeah.
and kind of like I mean I
Lovely.
know like you can't really provide like a source, but try to like kind of
Source.
like source it so people can look it up at least. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So
Try
one
your
of the
best.
things that a couple of the big things, right, that Israel accuses Sage Group of doing. One, you always hear the using of human shields thing like over and over and over again. Israel uses human shields. They use Palestinians as human shields in the West Bank. You can go and look at a lot of the night raids carried out by the IDF in the West Bank. Something they commonly do is they'll go into a house. They'll take a Palestinian, essentially like hostage, basically, and they'll use that Palestinian to break into another house. They'll kick the door down. They'll literally use them, literally, like physically, as a human shield, which isn't even what they accuse H group of doing. What they accuse H group of doing is like using civilian architecture as human shields. Um, like like the IDF literally uses human shields in the West Bank. They use their own citizens as human shields. They build underground tunnels in their metropolitan areas of Tel Aviv and stuff like that. You saw that used in the Iran attack. When Iran was attacking them, they fled underneath. Somehow they had tunnels. For some reason, when Israel uses tunnels, it's totally fine. When H group does it, it's like a big thing. They accuse H group of being a TS group. They accuse of the people who are send H group of resources of funding a TS group. Israel funds TS groups. They had a hand in arming Al Qaeda and ISIS. They are currently arming Abu Shabab in Gaza, which is an ISIS linked gang essentially because they're fighting age group for power within Gaza. So every single thing that the accused age group of doing, Israel is guilty of doing even tenfold because of the unequalness of power between the two. So
Do you have anything else in there? Like you think any other
um yeah, I
you
mean,
can think
look,
of?
like they keep coming back to October 7th, 1200, ostensibly 1200 Israelis were unalived that day. Really, it was about 800 civilians because 400 of them or IDF soldiers, which are actually valid military targets. And of course, it's not good to target civilians. I don't think you should be targeting civilians. But, with that in mind, Israel has carried out like 65, to 70 October 7th since that day. It's just like if you look at everything that they use as justification for what has become a G-side, it's like they've done to a degree of 100, a degree of 60, or they've done prior. They targeted civilians in the March of Return. Literally, the UN said that these were war crimes they carried out. They attacked and pew-pewed peaceful protesters who were marching up to the borders of Israel. So, everything, literally everything they say is just projection.
All right. So I guess I forgot I have like more on this. So how does how does Zionism function in the United States? Sort of like,
Okay.
in APAC and
Yeah,
stuff like that. Like the
it's a
sort of
good question. Yeah.
so basically,
So
are
there,
is the United States a Zionist occupied government?
you're gonna get me in trouble with that term, actually.
Okay, so
Um,
maybe don't say that then. So
yeah. No, 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 you're good. Well, here's the problem. So just as like a pretext, like Zionist occupied government, ZOG or whatever, this is like a term coined by Neil Schmatzy to like, to
right.
describe really in like an anti-Semitic analysis of the American government.
Yeah, I've kind of understood
However,
it from that perspective, but yeah.
yeah. Well, the problem with that is that our government is occupied by Zionists, and so it's actually an accurate term coined by someone who is unfortunately like deeply anti-Semitic. But essentially, what you have is you have a like a highly organized, highly connected lobby, which extends from individuals, it extends between groups like APAC, like Kufi, that do literally lobby our politicians on behalf of the Israeli government. They get away with this through this technicality, which is really not a technicality, but they say, well, this is being done by American citizens. So technically, these are just American citizens that are lobbying, on not behalf of the state of Israel, but, as people that are concerned about Israel, right? That's how they justify it. Obviously, that's like silly. This is an extension of the Israeli state. It's a propaganda machine of the Israeli state. Not only do we have those groups, though, but we have individuals. Most of these people, they are deeply powerful, they're deeply wealthy, they're able to use sort of key positions in these institutions of power to sort of use them and direct them for the interest of the state of Israel. We see this with like Madeleine Adelson, who was an Israeli-born citizen who's now a citizen of the U.S. Who lobbies separate from the already very powerful and wealthy lobbying groups. So there are individuals that lobby on behalf of the state of Israel. You can see that in the Trump campaign itself, literally $100 million donated to Trump with the explicit effort of, when Trump in his last term, he relocated the capital to Jerusalem, the embassy to Jerusalem, and recognize it as the capital of Israel. This was done through the request of Madeleine Adelson, actually. So you have these people who are American citizens, but they are like literally using their positions as American citizens to direct the American government to act for the interest of a foreign government. So like essentially we are, you know, politically and financially occupied by the Zionist movement, even in our own country and other countries in the West.
like, do you think the U.S. really disagrees with Israel on the strategy for Palestine?
Sorry, can you you cut
Like,
out for a second? Can you repeat the question?
do you think the United States kind of won't admit it, but kind of supports the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians?
Oh, they support it um,
I guess
through
what I'm asking
through
you is
like.
are
Mhm.
we owned by Israel or is Israel owned by the United States? Like, essentially, that's what I'm
Okay, yeah,
asking.
that's a valid question. So, in the beginning of the relationship between America and Israel, I think really America saw Israel as potential outpost for American foreign power and imperialism. And by the way, the Soviet Union also sort of saw this as well. They were kind of competing with the US as like who could sort of subsume Israel under their sphere of influence. That's why initially the Soviet Union recognized uh, Israeli independence, which they quickly went back on. But in the beginning, I think America did recognize and sort of support Israel um, with the effort of like subsuming them underneath their imperialist influence. And I think that did sort of carry on for like a couple decades, quite a while. I think eventually the power imbalance kind of started to actually shift more towards Israel. And it's kind of a unique case. You know, um, Even though America is like ostensibly the more powerful military, what Israel is really good at is utilizing Zionists in countries that they're citizens in, to sort of gain positions of power in Western institutions to like act on their interests. Moreover, they use blackmail in a lot of ways. So something that Israel is good at doing is gathering intel on politicians, on institutions, this kind of thing, and using them as blackmail to coax these institutions to act in their interests. We can see this in the nuclear proliferation of the country, and a lot of the instances in which America has sent them munitions has been at the behest of like blackmail, of the threat of utilizing the nuclear weapons that they essentially stole from the United States. And then we can see, it's kind of like an open secret now at this point that individuals like Jeffrey Epstein were essentially like agents of Mossad, and a lot of the underpinning motivations for the things that he did was to use as blackmail for the uh, direction of the Israeli state. So, they're able to use ways to get what they want for their national interests, not through military force, but through things like blackmail and money and yeah, it's a very well connected sort of mob like nation.
I just want to address that. So I think I mean, unless you have more to say, I think I've really wrapped this one up. But I just want to say, apparently, so Matthew just told me that apparently someone already like has a 5-minute video of you and is calling you like basically a Nazi, um, because of the
I
frog,
mean,
because of the frog.
you know what this reminds me? It's like we can. It's just like this reminds me of this was like the very beginnings of my like endeavor into politics was like I was in high school, but I still was like deeply tuned in to the Bernie Sanders campaign and like the Hillary Clinton campaign and stuff. I don't know if you remember this, but like there was this thing of like, oh, the OK hand symbol, right, was like a neo-Schnazi like dog whistle or something like that. And so they for a period of time, like 6 months or a year or something, anytime somebody like in politics was pictured doing something that resembled like
Yeah.
OK hand gesture, people were
Hmm.
like, oh, this person's dog whistling or they're a schmazi or something like that. It's like reminds me of that or like, I use a frog. I think frogs are cute and it's an emoji. And I don't even know what the connection is. Like I don't know how, I've yet is that like a schmoncy symbol? They use frogs? Like
I guess they're talking
I don't
about.
really
I guess they're referring to like Pepe. I guess, but like that wasn't even initially used that way.
okay.
I don't know. That was another co-opted. I don't know. You probably
Isn't
should take.
Pepe like a meme?
I mean, you probably should take the frog out though. I mean, just a suggestion. But like, I mean, if they listen to anything you
Well, now I
say,
kind of don't want to do it because
well, you
I
should
don't
leave
want
it
to
in
give
because
in
like
to
don't get canceled for it. But like, I just don't understand. Like, I mean, if they listen to anything you said, they would be like, oh, he's not a. So clearly, if it
I'm
was
a
just the frog,
deeply deep yeah, I'm a deeply
so
Marxist
Yeah.
deeply
So
motivated communists. I mean,
you literally talked about
this is
like
just
fucking
silly.
communism. So I just wanted to
Well, and
address it
this will,
because like I thought it was funny,
yeah,
and it kind of
it
like
is
proves your
funny.
point. But so
Yeah, exactly. And this is something we'll touch on later, right? Which is this like knack for the left to eat itself and try to constantly purity purge and this kind of stuff. Which this is probably a perfect headway into this. Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
So
so this was actually the one that I think. Well, I think now I'm about to get canceled by the modern left. So we're going in this endeavor together. So
cool.
I guess like I mean, are you cool with like? Do you think you can talk for 20 minutes, like 15 minutes, like just about
Yeah.
retribution?
Are
I
we?
can guide through the
Yeah.
questions
Like,
if you like, but just like break the whole thing down.
yeah.
Take a
Cool.
screenshot
Yeah,
if
I
you're in
can.
the chat and you want to
Mhm.
check it out the Substack. Even if you
Yeah.
disagree, the
This.
writing is beautiful, so check it out.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah, it's
you. I've
amazing
actually spent
writing.
a lot of
So
time
yeah,
on the writing. All of us do. We're very committed to. This is kind of like part and parcel of a lot of my frustrations, my emergent frustrations with the left throughout the entire time I've been. And just as like we didn't really get into my, I guess, personal background. We don't have to get too much into it just because we only have about 15 minutes left. But I've been a communist since I was like my first year in college. I'm like in my mid 20s now, and so like I started out as like a Bernie Sanders supporter, entered into college, got radicalized through peers of mine who were like sending me and showing me writings by Marx and Lenin and Mao and stuff like that. I was a member of a now defunct, I think it's defunct, um, leftist group called SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. I've been a member of the DSA for years. Like I wrote for a couple publications in college that were Marxist, been involved in the Marxist community for like half a decade now. Um, However, there is this like almost like deep desire um, to like constantly purge and constantly cleanse the leftist movement of like people that they don't see fit, taking into account like how slim our numbers already are. And I would like to think that like I am like a valuable, or I can bring value to the communist movement, but it's like, do you realize what we're doing? We're a weak movement already. We don't have numbers really at all, and we're trying to find reasons to take people out of the movement for a goal that we ostensibly were supposed to deeply care about. Like, how is that not counterproductive in a very destructive, dangerous, and like deep way? That's like something that I'm kind of like routinely haunted by, and I think is like a very big problem that we have addressed, and it's something that I wrote an entire article on called the Puritan Left. It's on our
right.
Substack.
Yeah, I read that too.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Yeah. What did you think? Did you have any questions about it
Um,
specifically, or?
I mean, I thought it was. I mean, I thought it was pretty spot on. I mean, like, especially like when you start getting into like, I mean, talk about like, uh, you can say it, but gun rights.
Hmm. Hmm.
So like, I
Sure.
mean, like, so what is it?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
like I'm kind of asking questions like for the sake of the audience, but like, what is like, is it a political party? Like, what is the
Oh, Red
goal?
Faction. So no. Yeah. No. Great question. So Red Faction is essentially, it has the goal of being a auxiliary organization of, it's a broad-based, broadly Marxist organization of communists who have the desire of like augmenting points in the left that we see that are weak, or that, can be sort of like a, reoriented towards the actual movement of communism. Um, One of which is this like sort of petty squabbling, this constant infighting, this constant purging. Really, a lot of this stuff is emergent because people are bored and they actually don't have power, and so they are vying for power and productivity any way they see fit. One of the ways in which they see is like constantly trying to keep the left, pure and clean. And I think maybe if I was to psychologize it, it's like a desire to, if we have the perfect left, right? If we have the perfectly moral left, then that means that we can gain power, and that's maybe all we're missing, right? Is we don't have the right people on the left. We don't have the perfect people on the left. No, no, no. That's not why we're not winning. We're not winning because we're not powerful. We
Can
don't
you
have the numbers and the influence to gain
can you
power.
kind of explain
Yeah.
just to emphasize how like important like this petty squabbling thing is, this point is, what are we fighting against? Like what, like, so I read this. What do you, so
Mhm.
kind of break down the future of like Peter Thiel and the Dark Enlightenment. Like what do you think about that when it comes to like basically
Yeah.
you
So.
said the modern day
Mhm.
fascism?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that is well. There's the modern day fascist movement is made up of probably a lot more than just the Peter
Well, yeah,
Thielian
no,
faction, but
right.
certainly that is and by the way, I think like the fascist right is like ascendant, and that is and they are not nearly as free motivated to like petty squabble and balkanize and stuff as we are. They're kind of like, and this should be worrying to a lot of leftists, but the Peter Thielian left, they're funding a lot of think tanks, a lot of like production houses, a lot of like podcasts, this kind of thing to push this idea, that we don't need a state, that really what should be run, society should be run by these like vitalist corporations, these corporate overlords, these technocrats, um, who, would rule with because they are sort of this aristocratic Nietzschean idea, this will to power. Oh, nice, beautiful.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Thanks,
Let's
Los.
go.
We got the
W.
support from the king, bro. Thanks,
Yeah,
man.
that's a big one. I
We
appreciate it,
worthy
Los.
peasant. We were. Oh my
Yeah,
goodness. Me worthy peasants. We've been showered gifts.
we
Thank you so
have.
much.
Yeah, we are.
He's a. I'm just gonna plug him real quick. Just like if you guys don't know, Los is king, bro. He'll host a live. He doesn't care what you think, but he'll give you a
Yep.
chance to speak. That's all that really matters, I think. And I think that kind of goes to
Everyone
your
gets
point. Yeah, everybody gets a voice,
right.
even like,
Everyone gets a voice.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think
Well,
that's a
and
good way
yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
handle.
And here's the rub of it. It's like one of the big things that the left constantly says and echoes is like you shouldn't platform fascists, right? Well, the problem with that is like they're already platformed. Like
Hmm.
they because of the internet, because of the way the internet functions, they have a platform. They're able to organize. They are organizing effectively, and if you look at some of the theorists of fascism, like Walter Benjamin and Trotsky and Gilles Dauvé, and these people, one thing they say is that fascism is ascendant in an era where capitalism is in decay and decadency, which certainly is the era that we're in now. Capitalism is in a period of decay and decadency, and the fascists are taking advantage of that. They're organizing people, they're radicalizing people. So they're already platforms. And if we kind of ignore them and like pretend like they don't exist, they're going to win. So
Right.
like what we really should be doing is not only just like trying to beat them back, like physically, and like, there's this like, punch a fascist or whatever. And it's like, okay, dude, like that's great, but like they're organizing on the internet. We can't punch people on the internet. So really, we should be debating them. We should be displaying how their ideas are bad and flawed, and they're not going to address any of the concerns of the working class that our ideas will. Our ideas are better, and when we don't, when we ignore them and we allow them to proliferate and organize, it actually makes us look weak. It makes us look
Yeah.
like we're scared to address them, and that we don't have the politics that are going to, address the issues and the underpinning and the wellspring of why they're ascendant in the first place. So we should be doing that, and instead of doing that, we're like fighting amongst ourselves and calling people revisionists and like
Right.
reactionaries and shit. And it's just
So so
it's
is
I
there
almost
any
sometimes think these people are like controlled opposition. You know what I mean? Whether they
is
know it or not.
yeah, is there any room, so like, I mean, I think I kind of got my answer, but so is there any room for intersectionality in Marxism?
Of course. I mean, look,
Yeah.
Mao said, something like women hold up half the sky. And they do. Obviously, you know, communism should be concerned with all of the issues that are present in the working class, which includes issues that, concern women, that include issues that concern people of color, disabled people. Like this is all should be inherent and like integral to the movement of communism. Um, but does that mean that things like standpoint epistemology should be celebrated, right? Does that mean that, somebody who has, some sort of like identity that has been historically subjugated has like a more valuable opinion than somebody else? I don't think so. I don't think that's like a good theory or like makes a lot of sense. I think the totality of the working class is exploited under capitalism. Everybody should have like a say in how the communist working class movement is constructed and mobilized. So of course we should be concerned with like all the issues in society. But I think a big problem, and this is emergent because of the new left in like the 60s, was that because it seemed like working class politics were like losing, there was like a effort to, you know, recuperate and reify the efforts of the communists to like cultural issues. You saw a lot of this stuff from like the writings of the Frankfurt School, who I think some of the stuff they say is actually good, and I utilize some of them. I think I utilize some of them even in that essay to critique them. Coincidentally enough, it comes from a lot of the postmodernists, but this idea that like, okay, we should, you know, we have to take over the institutions and the universities and stuff like that, and actually cultural issues are more important than working class issues. You see the ghost of this still haunting the left, and I think in like nefarious ways that are counterproductive to what our aim should be.